May I join you? The quiet question floated across the coffee shop, and for a heartbeat, every sound seemed to fade. Ethan Brooks looked up from the small corner table where he and his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, shared a single blueberry muffin before school. He blinked once, surprised that a woman dressed in an elegant navy coat had chosen the only empty chair at his table instead of the many others around the room. Her smile was polite, but carried a trace of weariness that expensive clothes could not hide. Ethan glanced at Lily, who offered an encouraging nod with the simple trust only a child could have. Of course, he answered, sliding his notebook aside. You're welcome here. The woman thanked him softly and settled into the chair, wrapping both hands around the warm paper cup she had just purchased. For several quiet moments, no one spoke. Outside, the streets of downtown Chicago stirred awake as buses rumbled past and commuters hurried beneath the pale morning sky. Ethan returned to reviewing construction estimates for the day's remodeling job, carefully marking numbers with a pencil that had been sharpened so many times it barely reached the length of his palm. Every dollar mattered. Every hour mattered. Ever since his wife had passed away 3 years earlier, life had become a careful balance between earning enough to keep their small apartment and making sure Lily never felt alone. Across the table, the stranger watched the father gently brush a loose strand of hair away from his daughter's face before reminding her not to forget her spelling test. It was such an ordinary moment that most people would never notice it, yet something about it lingered in the silence. Lily smiled. I'll do my best. Ethan smiled back. That's always enough. The woman lowered her eyes as if those words had reached somewhere deep inside her. A server approached with a fresh pot of coffee and accidentally knocked over the woman's empty sugar packet. Before anyone reacted, Ethan picked it up without hesitation and handed it back with a warm smile. Happens to all of us, he said. She thanked him again, this time with genuine gratitude. There was no sign that either of them recognized the other. No introductions. No curious questions about careers or backgrounds. Just 3 people sharing a quiet table on an ordinary morning that felt strangely meaningful. As Lily gathered her backpack, she whispered, Dad, she looks lonely. Ethan answered just as quietly. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is make sure someone doesn't have to sit alone. The woman heard every word, though she pretended to stare out the window. A faint smile touched her face before disappearing almost as quickly as it had come. Then her phone vibrated across the table. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time, the calm expression in her eyes completely changed. The woman picked up her phone, listened for only a few seconds, and answered in a calm voice that revealed almost nothing. I understand. Move the meeting back 30 minutes. I will call when I am on my way. She ended the call, slipped the phone into her coat pocket, and looked across the table with an apologetic smile. I am sorry. Work has a way of following me everywhere. Ethan nodded with quiet understanding. I know the feeling. Mine just looks different. He gathered the blueprints that had begun sliding toward the edge of the table while Lily zipped her backpack. The stranger noticed the worn corners of the documents and the careful notes written in neat handwriting. Every estimate had been checked twice. Every expense had been rounded down instead of up. She had spent years reading financial reports worth millions of dollars. Yet something about those humble pages caught her attention more than another corporate presentation ever could. Are you an architect? She asked. Ethan chuckled softly. Nothing that impressive. I renovate old houses. Mostly kitchens, bathrooms, whatever families can afford. It keeps the lights on. Lily smiled proudly. My dad can fix almost anything. Ethan laughed again. Almost. I am still working on the dishwasher at home. The little joke drew the first genuine laugh from the woman all morning. It surprised even her. She had attended charity galas filled with polished conversations and expensive smiles, but none of them had felt as effortless as this simple exchange over coffee. Outside, a light breeze carried yellow leaves across the sidewalk, even though summer had not completely surrendered to fall. The city moved with its usual urgency, but inside the cafe time seemed to slow. Ethan checked his watch. We should head out, kiddo, or your teacher is going to think I forgot what o'clock is. Lily hopped off her chair, then paused. She looked at the woman with innocent concern. I hope your meeting goes well. The woman blinked, clearly touched. Thank you. I hope your spelling test goes even better. Lily grinned. I studied all week. Ethan helped his daughter into her jacket before turning back toward the stranger. It was nice sharing the table with you. The pleasure was mine, she replied. As Ethan reached for the bill, the cashier waved him off. It has already been taken care of. Ethan frowned. There must be some mistake. The cashier smiled toward the woman. No mistake. Ethan looked uncomfortable. You really did not have to do that. She answered gently. Please let me. You shared something much more valuable than a table. Ethan hesitated for a moment before accepting with quiet dignity. Then thank you. I appreciate your kindness. They exchanged one final smile before Ethan and Lily stepped outside into the cool Chicago morning. The woman watched them disappear into the crowd, but instead of leaving for the delayed meeting, she remained seated. Her fingers rested on the coffee cup as though she had forgotten it was there. Across the street, Ethan stopped to help an elderly man gather groceries that had slipped from a torn paper bag. He never looked back toward the cafe. He never noticed the woman watching through the window with growing curiosity. And for reasons she could not yet explain, she quietly asked her assistant to find out who Ethan Brooks really was. Charlotte Bennett rarely asked her staff to investigate ordinary people, yet as her car rolled through downtown Chicago, she could not stop thinking about the father who had quietly placed someone else's comfort ahead of his own. Her assistant, Rebecca, looked up from a tablet. Would you like me to prepare the board meeting notes? Charlotte stared through the window for a moment before answering. In a minute. First, I need you to find someone for me. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Who? His name is Ethan Brooks. He renovates homes. That is all I know. Rebecca nodded without another question. Charlotte was known for making unusual requests, but this one felt different. Meanwhile, Ethan parked his aging pickup truck outside a modest brick house on the north side of the city. The paint on the porch had faded years ago, and the front steps leaned slightly to one side. Mrs. Alvarez, a retired school librarian in her 70s, opened the front door with an apologetic smile. I am sorry the place is such a mess. Ethan shook his head warmly. Homes are supposed to look lived in. She laughed softly and invited him inside. As Ethan measured cabinets and checked loose floorboards, he listened patiently while she spoke about her late husband, the neighborhood she had watched change over 4 decades, and her worries about stretching a fixed retirement income. When he finished calculating the estimate, he quietly crossed out the original number and wrote a lower one. Mrs. Alvarez noticed immediately. That cannot be right. You forgot to include labor. Ethan smiled. No, I just decided to charge less. She looked at him with disbelief. Why would you do that? He shrugged as though it were the simplest decision in the world. Because everyone deserves to feel proud of the place they call home. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. Your daughter must be very proud of you. Ethan paused for only a second. I hope she grows up believing kindness is never a bad investment. Several miles away, Rebecca entered Charlotte's office carrying a thin folder much sooner than expected. I found him. Charlotte accepted it with quiet curiosity. There was no mention of wealth, awards, or influential connections. Instead, the pages described years of dependable work, excellent customer reviews, volunteer projects for veterans, and occasional anonymous donations to a scholarship fund for girls interested in engineering. Charlotte frowned. Anonymous donations? Rebecca nodded. Small amounts. Every few months. Always from the same account. The records show they have continued for years. Charlotte slowly closed the folder. Ethan earned an ordinary living, raised his daughter alone, and still found ways to support someone he had never met. She whispered almost to herself, why would anyone do that? Rebecca had no answer. Charlotte looked again at the simple photograph clipped inside the file, and for the first time that day, she canceled another important meeting because she had a growing feeling that Ethan Brooks was carrying a story far greater than anyone around him realized. Charlotte had spent years surrounded by people who admired her success, yet very few had ever spoken to her the way Ethan had that morning. He had not recognized her name, had not searched for an advantage, and had not tried to impress her. The thought stayed with her long after the afternoon sun stretched across the windows of her office overlooking the Chicago River. Rebecca quietly stepped inside. The board is asking if you are joining the budget meeting. Charlotte closed the folder containing Ethan's background information. Tell them to begin without me. I will review the numbers later. Rebecca hesitated. You have never missed the opening of a quarterly meeting. Charlotte offered a faint smile. There is a first time for everything. After her assistant left, She opened another file that contained records from the scholarship foundation her company had created nearly a decade earlier. Hundreds of young women had received financial support through anonymous matching donations from ordinary citizens. Charlotte rarely looked beyond the final totals. This time she asked herself a different question. Who were the people quietly carrying part of the burden with no expectation of recognition? Across town, Ethan finished another long day of work. Dust covered his boots, and his shoulders ached from lifting lumber, yet his first stop was not home. He picked Lily up from her after-school program, where she ran into his arms with the excitement only a child could bring after an ordinary day. "I got one word wrong," she admitted while climbing into the truck. Ethan smiled. "Did you learn something?" "Yes." "Then it was still a good day." She laughed. "You always say that." "Because it is usually true." On the drive home, they passed a neighborhood community center preparing for its annual school supply drive. Volunteers carried boxes through the front doors while children chased one another across the parking lot. Ethan slowed the truck. "We have a few extra notebooks at home, do not we?" Lily nodded. "Can we bring them?" "I was hoping you would say that." An hour later, they returned with a small box filled with notebooks, pencils, and crayons they had collected over the past year. It was not much, but the volunteer accepted it with heartfelt gratitude. As Ethan signed the donation log, he left only his first name, just as he always did. Recognition had never interested him. What mattered was the smile on a child's face when school started. Unseen from across the street, a black sedan paused briefly at the traffic light. Charlotte happened to glance through the passenger window while returning from another meeting. She recognized Ethan immediately. She watched him lift the box from the truck while Lily skipped beside him, carrying a handful of colored pencils as though they were treasures. Neither of them noticed the luxury car. Neither of them knew anyone was watching. Charlotte remained silent until the light turned green. "Rebecca," she said softly, "does Mr. Brooks volunteer here often?" Rebecca checked a message that had just arrived from the investigator. "According to the director, he has been helping local families for years. Most people do not even realize he is doing it." Charlotte looked back as the community center disappeared behind them. The file on her lap suddenly felt incomplete, because no document could explain why a man with so little continued giving away pieces of what he had. And somewhere inside those unanswered questions, she sensed a truth that was about to change far more than either of them expected. The following Tuesday morning, Ethan returned to the same neighborhood coffee shop after dropping Lily off at school. He had promised himself he would only stay long enough to review invoices before heading to his next renovation project. But the familiar smell of fresh coffee and baked bread invited him to slow down for a few minutes. As he settled into the same corner table, he noticed someone approaching with a warm smile, already waiting. "May I sit here again?" Charlotte asked. Ethan looked around the nearly full cafe and laughed softly. "I think this table has become your lucky spot." She smiled as she took the seat across from him. "Maybe it has." This time, they ordered fresh coffee together, and the conversation came more easily. They spoke about Chicago traffic, unpredictable weather, favorite neighborhood bakeries, and the strange comfort of familiar routines. Charlotte listened far more than she talked. She discovered that Ethan never tried to make himself sound more impressive than he was. When he described his work, he spoke with quiet pride about restoring old homes instead of chasing larger contracts. "Every family deserves a place that feels safe," he said. "Sometimes fixing a loose step matters more than building a mansion." Charlotte wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "You measure success differently than most people." Ethan shrugged with an easy smile. "I suppose I do." She hesitated before asking another question. "Do you ever wish life had turned out differently?" Ethan looked through the front window where people hurried past without noticing one another. "There are days when I miss what I lost," he admitted. "But Lily reminds me every morning that I still have something worth protecting." Charlotte lowered her eyes. She understood that feeling more than she expected. For years, she had built companies, expanded foundations, and appeared on magazine covers. Yet the victories had never filled the quiet spaces waiting for her after each long day. Success had surrounded her, but companionship had quietly slipped away somewhere along the journey. Ethan noticed the thoughtful expression on her face. "I asked too personal a question without realizing it, did I?" She shook her head. "No. Actually, you reminded me that some questions are worth answering honestly." For the first time, she shared something about herself. She spoke of long meetings, constant travel, and the loneliness that could exist even inside crowded boardrooms. She carefully avoided mentioning the size of her company or the headlines attached to her name. Ethan listened without interruption. When she finished, he simply said, "People usually assume money solves loneliness. I have learned that loneliness does not care about bank accounts." Charlotte looked at him with quiet surprise. No one in her professional world spoke that plainly. There was no judgment in his voice, only compassion. Their conversation was interrupted when Ethan's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and his smile faded slightly. The supplier for his next project had informed him that the price of essential materials had increased again, pushing the renovation beyond his client's limited budget. Ethan sighed almost silently before placing the phone back into his pocket. Charlotte noticed the change immediately. "Everything all right?" she asked. Ethan forced a reassuring smile. "I will figure something out. I always do." He believed those words because he had no other choice. Charlotte believed them for a different reason. As they stood to leave, she realized she wanted to understand not only the man sitting across from her, but also the quiet strength that allowed him to carry burdens without asking anyone to notice. And before she reached the door, Rebecca called with a discovery that made Charlotte stop walking altogether. Charlotte answered Rebecca's call before stepping onto the sidewalk. "What did you find?" Rebecca spoke carefully, as though she understood the importance of every word. "The anonymous donor account does not belong to a trust or a corporation. It belongs to Ethan Brooks personally." Charlotte remained silent. Rebecca continued. "For nearly 6 years, he has been sending monthly contributions to the Bennett Future Scholars Foundation. The payments are small compared to the larger donations you usually see, but he has never missed a month." Charlotte looked back through the coffee shop window just as Ethan gathered his worn notebook and thanked the cashier before leaving. He had never mentioned charity. He had never hinted that he gave away money he could have easily kept. More importantly, he had no idea that the foundation he supported had been created by the woman he had shared coffee with twice. "Does he know anything about me?" Charlotte asked. "No," Rebecca answered. "Everything suggests he donates because he believes in the mission, not because of who started it." Charlotte slowly lowered the phone. That realization stayed with her for the rest of the afternoon. At the same time, Ethan drove across the city toward the home of a young couple whose kitchen renovation had suddenly become more expensive because of rising material costs. He reviewed every number again while sitting in his truck. The increase would erase nearly all of his profit. He could pass the cost to the family, but they had already stretched their savings to begin the project. He closed his eyes for a moment before making his decision. When the homeowners welcomed him inside, they immediately apologized. "We understand if the estimate has to change," the husband said. Ethan offered a reassuring smile. "Some prices did go up, but I will absorb the difference." Both of them stared at him in surprise. "You cannot do that," the wife replied. "You have your own family to support." Ethan nodded. "That is true, but delaying your renovation will cost you even more in the long run. We will make it work." They thanked him repeatedly, but Ethan simply changed the subject and began discussing cabinet measurements. On the drive home, however, the weight of his decision quietly settled on his shoulders. He knew the reduced income meant postponing repairs on his own aging truck for another month. It also meant saying no to a weekend outing Lily had been hoping for. Even so, he never regretted helping people when he believed it was the right thing to do. That evening, Lily sat beside him at the small kitchen table while finishing her homework. She noticed him studying a stack of unpaid invoices. "Are you worried?" she asked gently. Ethan looked up and smiled, although the tiredness in his eyes remained. "Only about solving tomorrow's problems." Lily reached into her backpack and placed a folded piece of paper in front of him. It was a drawing of the two of them standing beside their little truck under a bright blue sky. Across the top she had written in careful letters, "We always find a way." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "Thank you, sweetheart." Across town, Charlotte opened the annual donor report herself for the first time in years. As she searched through thousands of names, one small line stopped her completely. Ethan Brooks. Every monthly contribution had arrived on the same date for 6 consecutive years. Charlotte quietly counted backward until she reached the very first payment. Then she noticed the date. It was made only 3 weeks after Ethan had lost his wife. Charlotte read the donation records 3 times before she finally leaned back in her chair. The first contribution had arrived less than a month after Ethan's greatest personal loss, and every payment afterward had been sent with remarkable consistency. The amount was never large, but it never changed, even during years when inflation had driven construction costs higher and squeezed the budgets of families across Chicago. She quietly closed the report and whispered to herself, "He chose generosity when he had every reason to hold on to everything." The words lingered in the silent office long after sunset. The following afternoon, Charlotte asked Rebecca to arrange another visit to the neighborhood coffee shop without revealing her identity. "No interviews. No photographers. No announcements," she said. "I only want to talk." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "You are becoming curious about the man instead of the file." Charlotte answered with complete honesty. "The file cannot explain him." At nearly the same hour, Ethan finished replacing damaged flooring in a modest family home. The homeowner, Mr. Dawson, carefully counted the final payment before handing over the envelope. "You charged less than the other contractors," he said. "I still do not understand why." Ethan slipped the envelope into his tool bag. "Because your daughter needs a safe place to crawl before she learns to walk. That matters more than another line on my invoice." Mr. Dawson stood speechless for a moment before quietly shaking Ethan's hand. "People like you are hard to find." Ethan smiled with gentle humility. "There are more of us than you think. Most just do not talk about it." Later that evening, Ethan met Charlotte once again at the same familiar table. The cafe had become strangely comfortable for both of them, almost like neutral ground where titles and expectations stayed outside the front door. Charlotte studied him for a moment before asking, "Can I ask you something personal?" Ethan nodded. "You can always ask. I cannot promise I will have an interesting answer." She smiled. "Why do you help so many people when life has clearly not been easy for you?" Ethan remained quiet for several seconds. He looked toward the front window where the fading sunlight painted long shadows across the sidewalk. "After my wife passed away," he said softly, "I learned something I wish I had understood much earlier. Pain can make your world smaller, or it can teach you to notice someone else's. I decided I did not want my daughter to grow up believing hardship was an excuse to stop caring." Charlotte listened without interrupting. His voice carried no bitterness, no desire for sympathy, only quiet conviction. "Does it ever feel unfair?" she asked. Ethan laughed gently. "Sometimes. But fairness is not always something we receive. Sometimes it is something we choose to give." Those simple words settled deep inside her. For years, she had measured impact through balance sheets, investment reports, and annual growth. Sitting across from Ethan, she began wondering whether the greatest influence in the world could come from ordinary decisions repeated faithfully over time. As they prepared to leave, Charlotte reached into her handbag and removed a folded letter she had carried all day. She hesitated before placing it back inside without saying a word. She was not ready yet. Not until she understood one final piece of the mystery. Because there was still one question she could not answer. Why had Ethan chosen her foundation, out of thousands across the country, on the very month his own life had fallen apart? Charlotte spent the entire evening thinking about the question that refused to leave her mind. By sunrise, she had reached a decision. Instead of asking investigators for more reports, she would ask Ethan himself. The next afternoon, she invited him to meet at a quiet park overlooking Lake Michigan after he finished work. Ethan arrived wearing the same faded work jacket he had worn the first morning they met. He looked slightly puzzled, but greeted her with the same warm smile. "This is a nice change from the coffee shop," he said. Charlotte smiled. "I thought we deserved a different view." They walked slowly along the lakeside path while sailboats drifted across the water under a bright blue sky. Children laughed in the distance, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of the lake through the trees. After several minutes of comfortable silence, Charlotte finally asked the question she had carried for days. "Why did you begin supporting that scholarship foundation so many years ago?" Ethan looked surprised. "You know about that?" "I do." He lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking. "It started because of my wife, Emma." Charlotte waited quietly. Emma wanted every young person to believe that education could change a life. She was a public school teacher, and she loved encouraging girls who dreamed about careers where they were often underestimated. A few weeks after she passed away, I found an article about a scholarship program helping young women study engineering and science. I could not give much, but I thought maybe someone else's future could become a little brighter while Lily and I learned how to live with our loss. Charlotte felt her heart grow heavy. You never considered stopping the donations? Ethan smiled gently. Many times. There were months when I wondered if I could afford them. Then I remembered Emma telling her students that hope grows when someone chooses to share it. I wanted Lily to grow up seeing that hope is something we practice, not something we wait for. Charlotte stopped walking. The answer was even more moving than she had imagined. Do you know who created that foundation? Ethan shook his head. No, I never looked. It never seemed important. The mission mattered more than the name attached to it. Charlotte took a slow breath. She realized that every assumption she had carried about generosity had quietly fallen away. For years, she believed great change came from extraordinary wealth. Standing beside Ethan, she finally understood that lasting change often began with ordinary people making faithful decisions when no one was watching. She reached into her handbag and removed the folded letter she had carried for days. This time she handed it to him. I think it is time you knew something. Ethan accepted the envelope with polite curiosity. Before opening it, he looked at her. What is this? Charlotte answered softly, her voice filled with gratitude rather than pride. The truth about the foundation you have been helping all these years. Ethan looked down at the unopened letter, completely unaware that the next few lines would connect every quiet act of kindness from the past 6 years into one extraordinary moment he never could have imagined. With steady hands, Ethan unfolded the letter and read the first line twice before lifting his eyes in quiet disbelief. Charlotte met his gaze with a gentle smile that carried neither pride nor expectation. I founded the Bennett Future Scholars Foundation, she said softly. The scholarship you have supported for 6 years is one of the programs my company has funded from the beginning. Ethan looked back at the page, then at Charlotte again. You were telling me that all this time. She nodded. Yes, we met by chance, but your kindness reached my foundation years before we ever shared a cup of coffee. Ethan laughed quietly, not because anything was amusing, but because life sometimes revealed its greatest surprises without warning. I never imagined I would meet anyone connected to it. Charlotte folded her hands in front of her. Rebecca showed me your donation history. Every month. Never interrupted. Even after difficult years. Ethan looked across the lake where the afternoon sunlight shimmered on the water. Emma believed that education could open doors no one else could see. Continuing those donations made me feel like a small part of her dream was still alive. Charlotte's eyes filled with emotion. Do you know how many students your gifts have encouraged? Ethan shook his head. I never asked. 3 young women wrote letters this year describing how those combined donations helped them stay in school when they were ready to give up. They never knew your name. They only knew that strangers believed in them. Ethan stood silent, deeply moved by something he had never expected to hear. Charlotte reached into her bag once more and handed him another envelope. This one is different. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was an invitation asking him to join the advisory board of the foundation's community outreach program, helping identify families and neighborhoods that needed practical support beyond scholarships. Beneath the invitation was a handwritten note. We need people who understand dignity better than publicity. Ethan looked up with genuine surprise. I am not qualified for something like this. Charlotte smiled warmly. You already have the one qualification that cannot be taught. You have spent years living the values we hope to inspire. Ethan remained quiet for a long moment before answering. If accepting means helping more families, then I would be honored. Charlotte extended her hand, but Ethan responded with a grateful smile instead of formality. Thank you for trusting an ordinary contractor. She gently shook her head. You were never ordinary, Ethan. You simply never needed anyone to notice. A few weeks later, the foundation hosted a small gathering to celebrate students receiving new scholarships. There were no grand speeches about Ethan's generosity because he requested complete privacy. Instead, he stood beside Lily near the back of the room as young scholars shared their hopes for the future. One student spoke about becoming a civil engineer. Another dreamed of designing affordable housing for working families. Lily squeezed her father's hand and whispered, Mom would have loved this. Ethan smiled through grateful eyes. She already does. Charlotte watched the quiet exchange from across the room and understood that the greatest miracles rarely arrived with applause. They appeared in faithful choices repeated over time, in compassion offered without recognition, and in people who kept giving even when life had taken so much from them. As the audience rose to applaud the students, Ethan remained exactly where he had always been, quietly believing that changing one life at a time was more than enough. And in that peaceful moment, everyone who truly mattered finally understood that the strongest legacy is not measured by what we keep, but by the hope we leave in the hands of others.